Hi everyone, and welcome to our video exploring press release writing. Last week we learned how to write a news story. We also realised that news writing and press release writing are inseparable because a press release's function is to get your news out there, to encourage a journalist to run a version of your story. A press release can be viewed as a news story plus. That's my term. And in one or two ways, a news story minus. I'll explain more about that as we go on. So keep practicing until you're writing like a news writer. If you write your press release how news should be written, this makes it more engaging and more likely to be picked up. It also means that if an editor decides to run your story but as a shorter version than you sent, it will still make sense. Because remember, editors cut from the bottom up. So how is a press release different from a news story? Rather than telling the story yourself, you're sending it to a news provider. By news provider, I simply mean a newspaper or a news website or similar. You're providing the news provider with a news story, but it's a gift that they might or might not use, if you like. They're not as close to it as you are, so you need to do some things to encourage them to open the gift, as it were. You need to provide them with the information they need to place the story in the correct time frame, to understand the context the story comes out of, and to follow up for further clarification, information, or quotes if they wish. Press release writing is all about being concise, saying what you need to say in the most economical way possible. The whole press release should be no more than 1 page of a Word document in 10 or 12-point font. In old school terms, that's one side of A4. Here I've laid out for you the various elements of press release structure. Press releases are a very rigid genre, and you must stick to this structure. If you don't, it's likely a journalist will not wish to or have time to do the additional work to get to grips with your story. So pause the video and make a note of this structure or take a screenshot of it and keep coming back to it to check your press release writing against. Let's go through each of the elements. First of all, the date. This is the date when the press release is issued. Sometimes you'll see press releases with what is called an embargo time on them. This means they are released earlier than the organisation wants them to run as news, to give the journalists time to prepare their stories and ensure good full coverage, but also to avoid something that's time sensitive going out before they want it to. While it's worth being aware that this sometimes happens, you are only likely to need to use an embargo time if you're ever working in a time-sensitive environment. This might be, for example, the press office of a political party or a big business that wants to time the launch of a product exactly. For the context you'll be writing about for this module, a small business or small organisation, an embargo time will not be necessary. The headline is a simple summary of the main news point. Keep this pretty neutral language-wise and let the journalist come up with a catchy headline if she wants, as appropriate for the news provider she is writing for. For the body content, use the inverted pyramid structure that we explored for news story writing. With the quote or quotes, bring something new to the table, again as we discussed in relation to news story writing. Given that you're trying to get good news about your business or organisation out there, and given that press release style needs to be neutral, just like a news story, you can take the opportunity to be quite strategic with quotes and use quotes that really big up your business or organisation and paint it in a very positive light. Once you've finished writing the body content of your press release, you should always write ends in capital letters, like on the illustration. This might seem a bit counterintuitive because the press release is not actually finished, but the story part is finished. So writing ends makes it clear where the story content ends and where the additional information begins. So that's what I was talking about when I said that a press release was like a news story plus, because you're writing your little news story and then you are adding on some additional information afterwards, after you've written ends. And when I was talking about it being a news story minus, that's where I was kind of saying that sometimes with a press release you need to hold back even more than you do with a regular news story. For example, in the headline you want to keep it super neutral. So the additional information you should supply includes both contact details and what we call notes to the editor. We'll come on to notes to the editor in a moment. In contact details, provide the name of whoever is the main content in your business or organisation about this particular story. This will not necessarily be you. It might be you as the press officer or general communications person, but equally it might be the person whose words you have used in a quote, and who will therefore be the most appropriate person for the press to speak to when following up on the story. Or it might be the manager or CEO of the business or organisation. There's no right or wrong answer to who this contact person should be, but it should be agreed within the business or organisation before the press release goes out. You should include the contact person's name and email address. If the email address is different from the email address the press release is being sent from, for example, if you as the press officer are sending out the press release, but the contact person is the owner of the business or someone else, then you should make this clear. You should flag this up in your cover email. You should also include a phone number, preferably a mobile. Journalists are often keen to follow up by speaking to the contact person rather than emailing them, particularly if they want to explore the story more deeply or get some more quotes. The notes to the editor are really notes to the specific journalist who will be writing the story that they can use to find out more about the background to the story or the business or organisation. However, these are traditionally called notes to the editor, and that has become a set part of press release writing style, so you should stick with that and always call them notes to the editor. Sometimes you will send a press release to the editor of a news provider rather than a specific journalist in any case, where you don't know which journalist is responsible for a specific area or subject of coverage, for example. The notes to the editor should contain several things. Firstly, a brief outline of what your business or organisation does. Some people like to use the business or organisation's mission or value statement, if they have one, as a basis for this. But if you're doing that, make sure to change the person of the language from first to third. So mission statements are usually written in first person and second person, as in we provide services to you, blah, blah, blah. Whereas in notes to the editor, you want to keep it in third person. You want to say, for example, X business provides services in areas A, B, and C, etc. Secondly, include a web link if you have one, or indeed several if you have them. Lots of businesses and organisations these days, even small ones, have a website and several presences on social media, for example. Thirdly, include further background to the story if necessary. For example, if your press release is about a new development in an ongoing situation, you might want to briefly give the backstory and link to any previous coverage it has received. This is not necessary if the story is brand new and not related to anything that has gone before. Fourthly, if you wish, include a photograph. This is not necessary, but it can add interest. It's also worth bearing in mind that news providers don't have the resources they once did in terms of photographers. So if you want there to be a photograph with your article when it appears, sometimes it's worth providing it yourself. So if you want to include a photograph, what should you choose? The answer, as with many things, is it depends. You could include a simple headshot of a person or people relevant to the story, especially if it is quite a serious topic. However, if there is scope, it can be nice to provide an action photograph featuring people doing things relevant to the story. That might, for example, be an award winner taking part in the activity they have won the award for, or the business or organisation in action delivering whatever service they deliver, and so on. So I guess the more human interest or the more informal the story is, the more scope you have to be creative with your photography. For more serious stories, stick with a headshot. To be most successful in getting your press releases picked up and run with, you should work on getting to know the various news providers who are relevant to you. I don't necessarily mean getting to know journalists and editors personally, though of course that's a definite bonus, and you will probably do that as you develop in your career, depending on the career that you enter. But what I do mean by this is just getting to know what each news provider is like, what its characteristics are, how they differ from each other, and so on. So every news outlet is different in terms of the content they carry, the readers who engage with that content, and whether their scope is local, regional, or national. Try to target your press release at the most appropriate news providers. Be realistic, but equally, if you think you have a story of national significance, even if you're writing on behalf of a small business or organisation, be ambitious and send it to the biggest news provider. But as I said, be realistic about what is a national story. The differences between the news providers mean that their news values, while similar overall, are subtly different. Try to match your story and the angle you take on it to the readership profile. Think, for example, about whether it makes sense to focus on one specific person and tell the story through their experience, or whether a more overall approach that perhaps talks more about the abstract political priorities is better. You could think about writing 2 or more separate press releases taking slightly different angles and targeted at different news providers. Press releases are a fantastic way of getting your story out to a wider audience that you couldn't possibly reach yourself. However, in your efforts to get your story picked up, don't be tempted to shift out of the factual news genre and into a persuasive genre. Remember, you're providing content for news. Your aim in writing a press release must not be to try and get free advertising. Remember those striking statistics from Lewis et al. That we considered in one of the news writing videos? That while 60% of news content comes from press releases, only 10% of press releases that are submitted to news providers are used. In response to this, as well as obviously trying to make your press release writing skills the best they can possibly be, keep positive and don't be downhearted if you're not successful in getting a press release picked up the first time. Remember that if that happens, you're just one of the 90% who have that experience. As the old saying goes, if at first you don't succeed, try again. For example, if you send out a press release ahead of an event in the hope that journalists will visit or cover it, and then they don't do so, why not consider sending out a second press release after the event with amended quotes and interesting photographs from the event? That might just tip the balance to making the relevant journalist or editor think it is strong enough to run with.